The room was so silent you could almost hear the weight of the words echoing in the walls. The judge leaned forward, the gavel in his hand, and his voice sliced through the tension like a blade. Life. Just that one word. Not a paragraph, not a lecture, not even a full sentence, just one word. It landed heavier than any punch, louder than any shout. And with that, the teenager standing in front of the court, barely 18, still with the kind of baby face that reminded you he should be walking a graduation stage, not shackled in front of strangers, felt his whole future crash into a single syllable. People gasped in the gallery. Some leaned forward, others shook their heads. But for him, the young man at the center, it wasn't the sound around him that burned. It was the silence that followed. The silence that said, "This is it, you're done, the rest of your life is no longer yours." He swallowed, his chest rising and falling as though each breath fought against the weight pressing down on him. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering something, but the words drowned in his ears. He wasn't listening. He wasn't even really in the courtroom anymore. He was thinking of one thing, one person, his father, and not just any father. The man he was about to call wasn't an ordinary parent waiting at home. His father was the U.S. Attorney General, the highest legal officer in the nation, the man sworn to uphold the very system that had just crushed his son. What happens when justice collides with blood? When the man who enforces the law is forced to face its weight on his own child? That's the story you're about to hear. And trust me, you don't want to miss a single second of it. Now, before we dive deeper into this shocking case, let me ask you something. If you've ever believed that truth is stranger than fiction, if you've ever wondered how power, family, and justice can collide in ways that shake entire institutions, then this is your moment to stay. Don't just watch, be part of this conversation. Hit that subscribe button right now so you won't miss any of the stories we break down here. Smash the like button if you're already feeling the goosebumps from this unbelievable opening. And drop a comment below. What would you do if the system handed down a sentence like this to your own child? Would you trust the law, or would you fight the very structure you swore to uphold? Alright, now that you're in, buckle up. Because this story, it doesn't just pull you in, it grabs you by the collar, and it refuses to let go. The teenager's hands trembled as the bailiff guided him away from the defendant's table. His wrists were cuffed, the cold steel biting into his skin, but he barely felt it. His mind was elsewhere, racing, spinning, fighting to keep from collapsing under the crushing finality of that single word. Life. The crowd in the courtroom began to disperse. Reporters scribbled frantically, some already rushing outside to broadcast the breaking news. Black teenager sentenced to life would flash across headlines before the hour was out. For many, it was just another story in an endless cycle of trials and verdicts. But for him, it was the end of everything. Or so it seemed. As he was led through the side door, his lawyer leaned close again. "We'll appeal. We'll fight this. Don't give up yet." The lawyer's voice had conviction, but the teenager had heard enough promises in his short life to know when someone was speaking more for comfort than certainty. In the holding room, away from the crowd and cameras, the boy finally sat down on a steel bench. His chest heaved. He felt like he was underwater, lungs burning, searching for air that wasn't there. His knuckles whitened as he clenched his fists. And then, slowly, he lifted his head and said the words he knew would change everything. "I need to call my father." The guard raised an eyebrow. "Kid, everyone wants to call their dad right now." "No," the teenager said, his voice steadier than he expected. "You don't understand. My father, he's the Attorney General." The silence that followed was almost comical. The guard blinked twice, as if trying to figure out whether this was a cruel joke or a delusion. But the boy's eyes didn't waver. The truth hung there, heavy and undeniable. The call went through. Somewhere across town, in a federal office lined with marble and mahogany, the Attorney General of the United States picked up the phone. His schedule had been stacked with back-to-back meetings, press briefings, and policy discussions. But the moment he heard his son's voice, everything else fell away. "Dad, they sentenced me. Life. I don't know what to do." The Attorney General froze. For a man who spent his entire career wielding words like weapons in courtrooms, who had argued before justices and commanded juries. There was no immediate response. His breath caught in his throat. He glanced at the framed Constitution hanging on the wall, suddenly seeing it not as a document of justice, but as a barrier standing between him and his son. And here's where the story takes a sharp turn. Because this wasn't just a legal battle anymore. This was personal. This was blood. And when blood meets the system, the lines blur in ways most people can't even imagine. Now think about this for a moment. Imagine being the highest legal officer in the country, the man responsible for upholding the rule of law, the one who swears to keep politics, emotions, and personal interests out of the scales of justice. Then suddenly, the very system you defend crushes the person you love most in the world. What do? Do you stay the course, respecting the verdict and letting your child spend his life behind bars? Or do you leverage every ounce of power, every contact, every loophole to pull them out, even if it means bending or breaking the very laws you vowed to protect? That's the impossible crossroads the Attorney General faced at that very moment. And his next move would shake not only his own family but the entire nation. The Attorney General stared at the phone long after the line went dead, as if the receiver itself could explain how a single word, life, had bulldozed the map of his family. His pulse hammered in that quiet, polished office, the wall clock clicking like a metronome for a song he never meant to conduct. He straightened his tie, then loosened it. He reached for the flag pin at his lapel, then stopped. Some symbols were anchors, others were shackles. Today he wasn't sure which was which. He called his chief of staff first. Close my door. No calls unless it's the deputy or the solicitor. Draft me a recusal memo, full firewall. I want it airtight. The words came out crisp, automatic, like a pilot running a checklist while the engine coughed fire. Within minutes, the Deputy Attorney General, Maya Reyes, was on the couch, legal pad balanced on her knee, eyes already doing the math of consequence. You're recusing entirely? She asked. Not a toe in the pool, he said. Paper trail, signatures, timestamps, the works. Everyone who touches this case reports to you or an independent counsel you designate. I don't see, I don't hear, I don't know. She nodded slowly. It'll raise eyebrows. They're already up, he said. Let them touch the ceiling. But duty and desire were wrestling under his ribs. He knew the choreography. You build an ethical wall, you stay behind it, you trust the process. Still, the process had just swallowed his son whole. He felt a flash of anger, at the judge's measured voice, at the machinery of a courtroom that could compress a life into a syllable, at himself for not seeing this coming. Parents tell themselves they'll catch the falling glass before it shatters. Sometimes you don't even see it slip. Maya flipped to a fresh page. I'll loop in OPR and OIG. We'll get a special counsel recommendation by end of day. She paused. You should go home. He shook his head. I'm going to see him. Not as the Attorney General. As a father, he said. And the words sounded both smaller and infinitely larger than his title. Security tried to choreograph the visit, but he waved off the sirens and the spectacle. No motorcade canyon, no flashing lights, no swarm. He traded the polished corridors for the harsh fluorescence of a county detention center, where the air always smelled faintly of bleach and stale coffee. He signed the visitor log like anyone else, hand hesitant over the box labeled relationship. He wrote father and felt the letters bite their way across the form. They brought the teenager into a narrow room separated by glass, phones tethered like lifelines. Up close, the boy looked both older and achingly young, like grief had drawn new lines it hadn't earned the right to draw. The Attorney General picked up the receiver, his throat tight. Hey, kid. Hey. The teenager's voice wobbled, then settled. You came. Of course I did. He searched his son's face the way a diver searches the surface for light. We're going to appeal. I can't touch it. I won't. But we'll find the best to fight this. I promise you that. The boy nodded, swallowing hard. They said the tape was clear. The store camera. And the confession. The confession was at 3 a.m, the father said quietly. He wasn't supposed to know that, but the details had flown to him like sparks to tinder. You were 17 when they brought you in. You'd been awake how long? Almost 20 hours, the boy said, jaw tightening. They kept saying if I just told them the right story, I could go home. He closed his eyes for a beat. This was the part of the law the public didn't see. Fatigue turned into consent, suggestion into certainty, the soft pressure of a room calibrated to make truth and convenience shake hands. He forced his voice level. From now on, you say nothing to anyone unless your lawyer is sitting beside you and nodding. You hear me? I hear you. He could feel the words he wanted to say battering at the back of his teeth. This system is yours. Fix it. Rip out the gears and start over. But he'd spent a lifetime preaching that institutions outlive tempers, and now he had to swallow a truth that tasted like iron. Faith in process isn't faith because it's easy. It's faith because it costs. Back at the office, the nation had already split into choirs. Some voices sang about privilege and pull, predicting secret handshakes and backroom favors. Others raised the old refrain about riots and race and law and order, using the boy's face like a billboard for their talking points. Hashtags bloomed like weeds in concrete. News chirons learned his son's name, then learned to twist it. He returned to the marble and the seal and the tall windows, a man shrinking and growing with every step. Maya met him at the door with a stack of papers. Full recusal, signed and witnessed. We've recommended former Circuit Judge Ellis as special counsel. Clean reputation, conservative temperament, iron spine. OPR will audit every door that opens and every file that moves. Good, he said. Let the cameras roll on the process. If they want a show, give them transparency. She hesitated. There's something else. Your son's public defender filed notice of appeal, but the resources are thin. He exhaled. That word again, thin. Thin lines, thin margins, thin patience. We'll fund a defense through the Legal Aid Foundation. Not a dime from me, not a call from me. Anonymous donors. Keep my name out of it. That won't stop people from guessing. Let them guess, he said. I'm not buying justice. I'm buying time. As night fell, he walked the city without his entourage, hands in pockets like any other father lost in thought. He passed a bodega whose bell chimed as a teenager ducked inside for a soda, laughter trailing behind him like a kite. Simple, ordinary freedom. It pressed on the Attorney General's lungs until he had to stop and lean against a lamppost. He thought of little league games, of scraped knees, of a science project with a volcano that never quite erupted. He thought of the day he taught his son to tie a tie, the boy's fingers fumbling, the father's hands steady over his. Where exactly had the road bent? By morning, he had an answer he could live with, if not sleep with. If the system had failed, it would not fail this way, quietly, politely, invisibly. He'd show the country every hinge, every latch, every blind corner. Not by pulling strings, but by lighting the room. The ethical wall would stand. The cameras would roll. And inside that frame, evidence would speak or stammer, but it would not hide. He picked up the pen and signed the last page of the recusal. The ink pooled, dark and final. Then he set the pen down, and for the first time since the word life detonated his world, he let himself breathe. Morning sunlight filtered into the Attorney General's office, slicing long golden bars across the carpet, but he barely noticed. The headlines were everywhere now. News tickers scrolled his son's name in bold letters, each network spitting out commentary with the urgency of a storm chaser. Pundits debated everything from the judge's tone to the racial dynamics, to whether the Attorney General's recusal was genuine or merely optics. He had lived inside the rhythm of media cycles for decades. He knew the script. Outrage, analysis, counter-analysis, viral hashtags, then silence once the next scandal erupted. But this wasn't a cycle he could sit out. This was his son's life. At the detention center, the teenager sat in his cell, staring at the ceiling that was painted the color of fatigue. He could hear the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional clang of metal doors, each sound a reminder that time was dripping away like water through a crack. His cellmate, a man in his 30s with tattoos that told half a biography, looked at him with weary eyes. "You don't look like you belong here," the man muttered. The boy shrugged. "They said I did." That became the refrain in his head. They said I did. Cameras, confessions, prosecutors, they said he did. But truth wasn't always the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes truth sat quietly in the back row, ignored until someone dragged it to the front. Meanwhile, in the Attorney General's office, Maya Reyes laid a file on his desk. Special Counsel Ellis has accepted. He's already pulling transcripts, motions, evidence logs. Good, the AG said. He won't get much sleep. Maya hesitated. Sir, I need to tell you. Ellis is a bulldog. He'll treat this case like any other. If he finds your son guilty, he won't blink. That's why I chose him, the AG replied, though the words tasted bitter. If my son's freedom comes at the expense of bending the system, it won't be freedom. It'll be a theft. And theft always leaves fingerprints. Still, he couldn't stop the flood of memory. His son's first day of school. The backpack too big, shoes untied. The way he turned at the classroom door for one last glance. His son learning to drive, gripping the wheel like it might bite him. Each memory whispered, "You were supposed to protect me." By late afternoon, the case had already reached the floor of Congress. Senators on both sides of the aisle used the trial as a mirror to their agendas. Some thundered about crime and accountability, others about systemic bias and reform. His son had become more than a teenager. He was now a symbol, a pawn on the board of American politics. That night, the Attorney General sat alone in his townhouse, the television flickering silently in the corner. He turned it off, unable to watch his family's pain become national theater. Instead, he pulled a notebook from a drawer and began to write. Not memos, not statements, but a letter to his son. He wrote about resilience, about the fire that tests steel, about how faith isn't believing when the road is smooth but when it feels like the ground itself is collapsing. He paused, pen hovering, before adding the hardest line. I can't promise victory. I can only promise the fight. At the detention center, his son lay awake, the notebook of his own life filling only with questions. Was he truly innocent in the eyes of the law? Did the world see him as guilty before the trial even began? Could his father's position save him, or damn him further? Two men, bound by blood, now lived on opposite sides of the same wall. One was trapped by bars of steel, the other by bars of principle. And both knew the story was only beginning. The appeal process began like a spark in the dark. Small, almost fragile, but carrying the potential to ignite something bigger. The public defender filed the paperwork, and within hours, Special Counsel Ellis had already demanded full access to every shred of discovery. Police reports, interrogation transcripts, surveillance footage, forensic analyses. He wasn't there to comfort anyone. He was there to tear the case apart, piece by piece, and see if it held. The Attorney General followed at a distance, resisting every instinct to intervene. His daily briefings still included terrorism threats, cartel movements, cyber attacks. Yet his mind drifted back to a single courtroom in a single city, where his son's life had been measured and dismissed. He caught himself staring too long at his phone, waiting for updates that wouldn't come. That silence became its own kind of torment. Meanwhile, inside the detention center, the teenager adjusted to a rhythm that wasn't really living. Breakfast at dawn, head counts, the scrape of trays, the hollow echoes of doors shutting. He kept his head down, his body language a shield. But even in there, whispers followed him. That's the AG's kid. Some muttered it with awe, others with resentment. It didn't matter, either way he was marked. One evening, during a tense recreation period, a larger inmate approached him. So what's it like? The man sneered. Your daddy gonna make all this disappear? The boy clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to respond. Silence was safer, but silence also painted him as weak. Before it could escalate, his cellmate stepped forward, placing a hand on the larger man's chest. Leave him. He doesn't owe you a story. The tension dissolved, but the message was clear. In prison, even your last name could become a weapon. Back in Washington, Ellis convened a small team in a dimly lit office, stacks of files crowding every surface. He wasn't flashy. He didn't make speeches. He simply pointed at inconsistencies with a pencil and said, "Explain this." And more often than not, there wasn't an explanation, at least not a good one. For example, the surveillance footage. The prosecution had leaned on it heavily, claiming the grainy images placed the boy at the scene. But Ellis slowed the footage frame by frame. The timestamp skipped seconds. The angle was partially blocked by a shelf. And the figure in the hoodie? Ambiguous at best. "That's not proof," Ellis muttered. "That's a Rorschach test." Then there was the confession. Hours of interrogation, reduced to a few typed pages, signed by a teenager running on no sleep, no food, and relentless pressure. Ellis read it once, then again, tapping his pencil harder each time. "This isn't a confession," he finally said. "It's compliance. There's a difference." Word of these cracks began to leak. A journalist hungry for an angle published a piece questioning the strength of the case. Social media latched on, the story trending under hashtags demanding retrial, justice, reform. Others pushed back, arguing the AG's influence was already poisoning the process. Every development split the nation into louder halves. At night, the Attorney General sat in his kitchen, a single lamp casting a circle of light around his untouched coffee. He wanted to call Ellis, to demand reassurance, to beg for speed. But he held back. The wall he'd built between himself and the case was the only shield against accusations of corruption. He'd promised his son transparency, and that meant enduring the helplessness of distance. His son, however, was not so shielded. In his cell, he replayed the interrogation over and over in his mind. The voices telling him he could go home, the way exhaustion blurred truth until it all sounded the same. He wondered if the system had ever been about truth at all or just about efficiency, closing cases, ticking boxes, moving the machinery forward. The appeal date was set. The courtroom would open its doors again. But this time, it wouldn't just be about one teenager. It would be about whether the system itself could admit it might have been wrong. And that question, once asked out loud, was a wildfire. The courthouse looked different the morning of the appeal. It wasn't just a building of stone and glass anymore. It was a stage, and the nation was the audience. Satellite trucks lined the street, their dish antennas pointed skyward like watchful eyes. Reporters jostled for position behind barricades, microphones ready, while protesters filled the sidewalks. Some carried signs demanding justice for the teenager. Others waved placards insisting the system had already spoken. The air buzzed with chants, camera shutters, and the low rumble of tension. Inside, the teenager sat at the defense table once again. But this time, something was different. His shoulders were still tense, his eyes still shadowed by sleepless nights, yet there was a flicker of something else, hope. He glanced at the gallery and caught sight of his father, sitting quietly in the back row, expression carved in stone. The Attorney General was there not as an official, not even as a strategist, but as a father watching his son fight for daylight. Special Counsel Ellis stepped forward with the measured calm of a man who had no interest in theatrics. "Your Honors," he began, his voice steady. "This appeal is not about sympathy. It is not about politics. It is about whether the conviction of this young man was secured through lawful, reliable, and fair means. We contend it was not." The prosecution fired back, their lead attorney brimming with confidence. "The evidence is overwhelming. Surveillance footage, a signed confession, eyewitness accounts." But Ellis cut in sharply. "Let's speak of that so-called confession. My client was interrogated for nearly 15 hours. No guardian, no attorney, not even a break for food. By the time those words were put on paper, he was 17 years old, disoriented and desperate to go home. That is not a voluntary confession. It is coercion dressed in official letterhead." The courtroom murmured. The judges leaned forward, one of them tapping a pen against the bench, eyes narrowing. The words landed heavier than the gavel that had sentenced him weeks earlier. Then came the surveillance footage. The prosecution queued up the grainy video on a screen, freezing the frame where a hooded figure moved across the store aisle. "There," the prosecutor said, pointing. "The defendant." Ellis walked slowly toward the screen, letting the silence stretch. Or is it? He asked. He pressed a button, advancing frame by frame. The figure blurred. The timestamp jumped. The camera's angle obscured half the face. Ellis turned back to the bench. This could be anyone. The state built its case on pixels and guesswork. The teenager's heart pounded. For the first time, he felt the weight shift. Not away, not completely, but just enough to imagine breathing again. The prosecution pushed hard, introducing an eyewitness who swore they saw him near the store that night. But Ellis pounced, cross-examining with surgical precision. Sir, how far were you from the scene? About 50 feet. At night? Yes. With the streetlights behind the figure, not in front? The witness hesitated. Yes. And you didn't come forward until after you saw a news report with my client's picture? The silence that followed was damning. Back in the gallery, the Attorney General sat motionless, hands folded, every muscle in his body taut. He wasn't allowed to interfere, wasn't allowed to speak, but inside he was screaming. He saw the cracks widening. He saw the possibility that truth might finally claw its way out from under the rubble. Outside, the crowd roared each time an update spilled onto social media. Clips of Ellis dismantling the state's evidence went viral within minutes. Hashtags trended. Commentators speculated. For a moment, the boy was no longer a symbol of defeat but of resistance, of the stubborn possibility that the system could be challenged from within. By the end of the day, the panel of judges announced they would review the case fully before rendering a decision. The gavel fell, signaling adjournment, but this time, the sound didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a question mark hanging in the air. As the teenager was led back into custody, he turned his head toward the gallery. For a split second, his eyes met his father's. No words passed between them, but both knew the same truth. The fight was no longer about survival alone. It was about redefining what justice meant when the system itself stood on trial. The morning after the appeal hearing, the country felt like it had been shaken awake. News anchors replayed clips of Ellis tearing holes in the prosecution's evidence. His words now spliced into dramatic montages across every network. Some hailed him as a hero fighting for truth. Others accused him of exploiting technicalities to free a criminal. The teenager's face was everywhere, on magazine covers, political blogs, late-night talk shows. He was no longer just one young man caught in a storm. He was the storm itself. In Washington, the Attorney General arrived at the Department of Justice to a gauntlet of cameras. Questions flew like darts. Mr. Attorney General, is your son innocent? Did you use your influence to sway the special counsel's selection? Do you believe the justice system is broken? He didn't flinch. He simply repeated the same line. I am recused. The process must speak for itself. Then he walked inside, the marble corridors echoing with footsteps that felt heavier than ever. Behind closed doors, aides debated how to manage the optics. Some wanted him to make a public statement separating his role as father from his role as Attorney General. Others urged him to step down altogether until the case resolved. Maya Reyes, ever the realist, cut through the noise. Every word you say is ammunition. Right now, silence is your strongest defense. But silence at home was unbearable. That evening, he visited his son again. This time, they sat face-to-face across a metal table in a private room, guards stationed outside. The boy's eyes were red, not from tears, but from exhaustion. They talk about me like I'm not even real, the teenager said. Like I'm just a symbol, a headline, a hashtag. But when I'm back in that cell, it's just me and four walls. None of them know what that feels like. The Attorney General leaned forward, lowering his voice. They don't, and they won't. But I do. I carry it every hour of every day. The world may see you as a headline, but I see you as my son. Don't forget that difference. It's what will keep you alive in here. The boy nodded, biting the inside of his cheek. Do you think they'll let me out? He wanted to say yes. He wanted to promise freedom. But promises had already betrayed his son once. Instead, he said, I think the truth has a way of clawing through, even when people bury it. But you've got to hold on long enough to see it. Meanwhile, Outside the detention center, protesters clashed. One group demanded immediate release, chanting his name like a battle cry. Another shouted back about law, order, and consequences. Police stood between them, sirens flashing, the tension on the edge of ignition. In Congress, hearings were quietly proposed, some calling for oversight of the Justice Department, others pushing to investigate whether the Attorney General had meddled in the process. Senators seized the moment to score points on television. Justice had become theater, and his son's case was the stage. Ellis, however, ignored the noise. Late into the night, he sat with his team combing through phone records, forensic reports, sworn statements. They found more anomalies. A witness who had recanted off the record. A fingerprint analysis that came back inconclusive but had been presented as definitive. A chain of custody form missing a signature. Each piece small, but together they painted a picture of haste, maybe even negligence. Ellis scribbled notes in the margin of a file. "This isn't just a weak case," he muttered. "This is a house built on sand." Back in his townhouse, the Attorney General sat in his living room, television off, city lights flickering beyond the window. He poured a glass of water, but it sat untouched. He thought about his oath, the one he'd sworn with his hand on a Bible and his eyes on the nation. And he thought about the first time he'd held his son, tiny fingers curling around his. Two promises, colliding. He whispered into the empty room, "How do you serve justice when justice won't serve you?" The silence answered back. And as the appeal decision drew closer, the world braced for impact. The three-judge panel retreated into chambers, carrying with them the weight of a nation's attention. Their deliberations weren't televised, their voices hidden behind mahogany doors, but leaks have a way of seeping into the world when the stakes are this high. Clerks whispered, aides texted, and soon fragments of the discussion began to trickle out. Serious procedural issues. Chain of custody compromised. Confession under questionable conditions. Each phrase leaked like drops of water, and outside the courthouse those drops became a flood. Commentators speculated endlessly, parsing the scraps as if they were scripture. Some claimed the conviction would be overturned within weeks. Others warned that technicalities didn't erase guilt. The country wasn't just watching, it was holding its breath. Inside his cell, the teenager clung to the fragments as though they were lifelines. His cellmate nudged him one night as the lights dimmed. "Word is, your lawyer's tearing it up out there." "He's not my lawyer," the boy said softly. "He works for the court." The man smirked. "Makes no difference. Someone's fighting. That's more than most of us ever get." Meanwhile, Ellis's team kept uncovering flaws. One of the biggest came from the forensic reports. The prosecution had leaned heavily on a fingerprint supposedly lifted from a soda bottle at the crime scene. But when Ellis demanded the raw data, what he got back was sloppy, incomplete. The lab tech had marked the print as partial and non-definitive in early notes. Notes that somehow never made it to the defense. That wasn't a mistake. That was suppression. Ellis rubbed his temples, staring at the report. This isn't just error. This is misconduct. The word carried weight. Misconduct meant the rules of the game had been broken, not bent. Misconduct meant accountability, not just correction. The Attorney General read about it the way everyone else did, on a news alert that lit up his phone during a late-night strategy meeting. He excused himself, stepping into the hallway, staring at the headline glowing against the screen. Suppressed evidence in teen's case, sources say. His chest tightened. Relief and fury collided inside him. Relief that cracks were finally visible. Fury that his son's life had been gambled with negligence. Maya found him leaning against the wall, phone still in hand. "You need to be careful," she said quietly. He nodded. "I know." But his eyes burned with something she hadn't seen before. Not just anger, but a kind of resolve that looked unshakable. Across the country, the story morphed from one trial to something larger. A referendum on justice itself. Civil rights groups called for investigations. Law students packed into classrooms to debate the case. Politicians sharpened their rhetoric, sensing opportunity. And in households across America, parents looked at their own children and wondered how close they might be to the same fate. Back in chambers, the judges weighed precedent against principle. One argued for caution. Overturning a conviction could unravel public trust. Another countered that public trust was already unraveling, and only transparency could mend it. The third sat in silence, flipping through the transcript, pausing at the words the boy had spoken in the interrogation room. "I just want to go home." Those 6 words rang louder than any legal argument. When the judges finally emerged, no decision was announced. Not yet. They promised a ruling within weeks. The gavel struck, and once again the crowd erupted outside. Cheers, jeers, camera flashes painting the courthouse steps in strobe-like bursts. The Attorney General left quietly, head down, escorted by agents. But in the privacy of his car, he let himself whisper one sentence into the silence. "We're not at the end. We're at the beginning of the reckoning." And though his son couldn't hear him, those words hung in the air like a vow. The revelations of misconduct hit the country like a thunderclap. What had begun as a local conviction was now a national scandal. Networks ran primetime specials dissecting every piece of suppressed evidence. Editorials demanded resignations from the district attorney's office. Civil rights leaders stood on courthouse steps, microphones thrust into their faces, declaring the case a symptom of something rotten in the system. For the Attorney General, the political storm was unavoidable. Senators called for hearings. Commentators accused him of orchestrating the leaks, even though Ellis was working independently. Conflict of interest became the phrase plastered across op-eds. In the White House briefing room, reporters pressed the press secretary, "Does the president still have confidence in the Attorney General?" The answer, measured, cautious, deliberately vague, only fueled the fire. At home, the AG found little refuge. His townhouse had become a magnet for protesters and camera crews. Every morning, he stepped past bullhorns and banners. Some shouted words of encouragement, others spat accusations. It was a daily walk through judgment, the marble steps of justice replaced by cracked concrete and angry voices. Inside the detention center, the teenager felt the weight differently. Days blurred together. His hope tethered to rumors and half-truths drifting in through guards, lawyers, or the television in the common room. The uncertainty gnawed at him. One night, lying on the narrow bunk, he whispered to his cellmate, "What if they don't let me out? What if all this noise doesn't change anything?" The older man shook his head slowly. "Hope's dangerous in here, but so is losing it. You gotta balance on that wire, kid." The toll showed on his face. Hollowed cheeks, eyes that carried both fear and defiance. Letters from strangers began to arrive, hundreds of them. Some offered prayers, others harsh condemnation. He read them in silence, each one a reminder that his life had become public property. Ellis, meanwhile, pressed forward with surgical intensity. He filed motions demanding sanctions against the prosecution for evidence suppression. He subpoenaed lab technicians, cross-checking every report. In a dim office stacked with boxes, he told his team, "We're not just appealing a conviction, we're excavating a cover-up. And we won't stop until we've reached the bedrock." The Attorney General read updates like a man pacing the edge of a battlefield. Every instinct screamed to intervene, to leverage his position, to call in favors. But each time, he clenched his jaw and reminded himself, recusal is the only shield you have. Break it once, and every victory becomes suspect. Still, the cost of restraint was steep. One evening, his son's voice came through the phone line, fragile but steady. "Dad, it feels like I'm disappearing in here, like I'm fading." The AG gripped the receiver until his knuckles whitened. "You are not disappearing. Do you hear me? You are not fading. The world sees you, and so do I. Hold on. Just hold on." But after the call ended, he sat in the dark, wrestling with a truth he couldn't speak. The system might still fail. The cracks Ellis uncovered were damning, but courts were cautious, tradition heavy. Justice moved slowly, and his son's spirit was eroding faster than the legal gears could turn. Outside, the nation's divide deepened. Some argued the boy's ordeal proved the need for sweeping reform. Others painted him as a criminal shielded by privilege. Talk radio boiled. Hashtags collided. Families argued across dinner tables. The case had become a mirror in which America saw both its wounds and its denial. Through it all, the boy lay in his cell at night, staring at the ceiling. Each day was a battle against despair. Each rumor, each letter, each call was a reminder that his life was suspended in a limbo that could either free him or bury him forever. And somewhere, behind the noise, the judges drafted their decision. The day of the decision loomed like a storm cloud over the entire nation. Rumors swirled. Some said the judges had already decided to overturn the conviction. Others whispered they would simply order a new trial. The truth was locked away in chambers, sealed in envelopes no one had yet opened. And so the country waited, restless and divided, clinging to speculation the way sailors cling to driftwood in rough seas. For the Attorney General, every morning felt like walking into crossfire. His staff briefed him on terrorism threats, cybersecurity breaches, international crises. Yet his mind snapped back to the courthouse like a rubber band. He answered questions in clipped tones, his patience stretched thin. When reporters shouted at him on the courthouse steps, he gave nothing. Not a word, not a glance that could be twisted into influence. But inside, his heart hammered with the same question everyone else was asking. Will my son walk free? In his cell, the teenager paced, his body carrying nervous energy he couldn't burn off. He pressed his palms to the concrete wall, trying to ground himself. The air was thick, heavy with anticipation. Even guards whispered about the coming ruling, their voices carrying through the halls like distant thunder. He sat down on his bunk, pulling a small stack of letters from his pocket. Notes from strangers who believed in him. He read one over and over, the words underlined in shaky handwriting. Don't let them write your ending for you. The morning of the announcement, the courthouse was unrecognizable. Hundreds of people crowded the steps, chanting, praying, shouting. Television crews set up scaffolds, their cameras trained on the doors. Protest signs bobbed in the air, some painted with the teenager's face, others declaring no one above the law. The divide was stark, each side unwilling to yield an inch. Inside, the courtroom was hushed, electric. The teenager sat at the defense table, his wrists uncuffed for the proceeding, his suit jacket borrowed and slightly too big. He glanced over his shoulder once, locking eyes with his father. The Attorney General sat motionless, expression carved from stone, but his clenched hands betrayed the storm inside him. Special Counsel Ellis stood near the bench, a stack of files under his arm but unused. This was no longer about arguments or evidence. It was about judgment. He gave the boy a small nod, just enough to say, whatever happens, you're not alone. The judges entered, robes sweeping the floor, faces solemn. The gallery rose, then sat again. Time seemed to warp. The chief judge adjusted his glasses, unfolding a paper that trembled slightly in his hand. The entire nation seemed to lean forward at once. This court, the judge began, voice steady, has reviewed the record, the testimony, and the evidence surrounding the conviction of the appellant. His words echoed through the chamber, deliberate, heavy, each syllable carrying the weight of freedom or finality. The boy's chest tightened, his father's jaw clenched. Reporters' pens hovered. Outside, the crowd held its collective breath. The ruling was moments away. The chief judge cleared his throat, the courtroom hanging on the pause as though time itself had stopped. It is the opinion of this court, he began, that the conviction entered against the appellant cannot stand. The judgment of the lower court is hereby vacated. For a moment no one moved. The words seemed to hover, as if the air itself needed time to absorb them. Then the silence cracked like glass. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Reporters scrambled for their phones, fingers flying. Outside, the roar of the crowd swelled into a tidal wave, cheers colliding with shouts of outrage. The teenager sat frozen. His mind struggled to translate legal language into reality. Vacated. Did that mean free? Did that mean done? His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, You're out. They've overturned it. You're walking today. His chest heaved. For weeks, he'd imagined this moment. Yet now that it had arrived, it felt unreal, like a dream too fragile to touch. At the back of the room, the Attorney General exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging for the first time in months. He didn't smile, didn't raise a fist, but his eyes shimmered with something raw and unguarded. A lifetime of discipline cracked open for a single heartbeat as he whispered, "Thank God." Special Counsel Ellis stood firm, expression neutral. He wasn't there for celebration. He was there for truth. But even he allowed himself a small nod, a recognition that the system, battered and imperfect, had, at least this time, corrected itself. The prosecutors sat stone-faced, already preparing statements for the cameras. One of them muttered, "This isn't over." And in a way, it wasn't. The ruling didn't erase the months the boy had spent in a cell, the whispers that would follow him for years, the permanent scar of being judged guilty before proven innocent. Freedom didn't erase memory. As deputies removed the shackles from his wrists, the teenager rubbed the raw skin where metal had bitten flesh. He stood slowly, legs shaky but determined. The bailiff gestured toward the exit, and for the first time since the word life had crushed him, he walked without chains. In the gallery, cameras clicked like machine guns. Protesters outside erupted, half in celebration, half in fury. The courthouse steps became a battleground of signs, chants, tears, and clenched fists. Some shouted, "Justice served." Others screamed, "Corruption." The air vibrated with conflict, as though the decision had split the country down a jagged seam. Reporters swarmed Ellis as he emerged. "Do you believe justice was done today?" one asked. Ellis looked directly into the camera. "Justice isn't a destination. It's a fight. And today, at least, we fought closer to the truth." The Attorney General left through a side door, escorted by security. But before he stepped into the waiting car, he caught sight of his son across the lot, surrounded by guards and family. Their eyes met, and in that instant the noise of the world fell away. No microphones, no cameras, no chants. Just father and son, bound not by office or title, but by blood and survival. The boy whispered to himself, as if testing the words on his tongue, "I'm free." And though he knew the world outside would be complicated, divided, even hostile, that single truth was enough to carry him through the courthouse doors into the blinding light of the day. Freedom didn't come with silence. Came with a storm. The teenager barely stepped onto the courthouse steps before microphones and cameras swarmed him. Questions fired in rapid succession. "Do you feel vindicated? What do you say to those who still believe you're guilty? What's next for you?" His lawyer raised a hand, shielding him, guiding him through the crush of voices. Every word he didn't say became another headline. Across the plaza, protesters shouted, some in joy, others in rage. "Justice for all" clashed with "system rigged." Police worked to keep the lines from colliding, but the sound was deafening. America arguing with itself at full volume. The Attorney General watched from a distance, his face unreadable to the cameras. Inside, however, a war raged, pride in his son's survival, relief that the legal system had corrected itself, fury that it had nearly destroyed his boy in the first place, and a deep unease that this story wasn't just personal anymore. It was a symbol, a spark that would ignite debates across the nation. That night, father and son sat together for the first time without glass, guards, or shackles between them. The townhouse felt smaller, the walls lined with memories that now carried new weight. For a long time, neither spoke. The teenager finally broke the silence. "I thought I was gone, Dad. I thought they buried me." The Attorney General's throat tightened. "They tried. But you clawed your way back. You did too." He shook his head. "No, couldn't. I swore an oath, and that oath kept me on the sidelines. Ellis, the system, imperfect as it is, that's what pulled you through." The boy looked down at his hands. "Then why do I still feel like I lost?" Because he had, the AG thought. He had lost time, innocence, and trust. He had lost the belief that justice was automatic. But aloud, he said, Because freedom doesn't erase scars. It just means you get to live with them. And maybe, someday, you get to turn them into something stronger. The following weeks were chaos. Media outlets hounded them. Politicians used the case as ammunition. Some demanded the Attorney General's resignation, arguing his presence alone had tilted the scales. Others praised his restraint, pointing to the recusal as proof that transparency could prevail. His approval ratings plummeted and surged in equal measure, depending on which poll you trusted. The teenager struggled too. Everywhere he went, eyes followed. Strangers approached with sympathy or suspicion. Social media dissected his every move, what he wore, where he walked, who he spoke to. Freedom felt like a different kind of cage, invisible but relentless. One evening, the Attorney General found him sitting on the back steps of the townhouse, staring at the dark sky. "You're quiet," he said, easing down beside him. "I don't know how to be normal anymore," his son admitted. "I don't even know what that means now." The AG looked at him for a long moment. "Normal is overrated. You don't go back from this. You go forward. And forward means you decide who you are. Not the court, not the cameras, not the noise." The boy nodded slowly. "And what about you? You gonna keep being the Attorney General?" The question cut deep. The AG had wrestled with it for weeks. Finally, he answered, "For now. But I know this much. I'll never look at the word justice the same way again." And maybe that was the legacy of this ordeal. Not headlines, not polls, not speeches, but a father and son, scarred yet unbroken, stepping into a world that demanded answers. A world where justice wasn't a statue of blind certainty, but a living struggle, messy, painful, and worth fighting for. The teenager stood, breathing in the night air as if it were the first time. "Then let's fight," he said softly. The Attorney General rose beside him, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. Together. And for the first time in months, the word life no longer sounded like a sentence. It sounded like a promise. And now let's step back. Because this story, yes, it's about a courtroom, a teenager, a father who happens to hold the highest legal office in the land. But if you're really listening, you'll realize it's about us too. About the way we live inside systems that are supposed to protect us, but sometimes fail. About how quickly a single word, life, can redraw the map of everything we thought we understood. Think about it. What would you do if it were your child standing in front of that judge? Would you trust the system to be fair? Or would you claw at every wall, break every chain, just to pull them back into the daylight? And what about the rest of us, the bystanders, the spectators, the citizens watching from a distance? It's easy to scroll past the headlines, to shake our heads at the noise. But justice isn't something that only happens in marble buildings and court transcripts. Justice is something we're all responsible for, every time we decide whether to see someone as a person or a problem, a story or a stereotype. This case may sound extraordinary, but its roots are ordinary. They're in the small biases, the quick judgments, the shortcuts we accept because we tell ourselves the system will sort it out. But systems aren't machines, they're reflections of us. If we don't challenge them, sharpen them, demand better from them, then they calcify. And then one day, it's not just a teenager in chains, it could be yours, could be you. So ask yourself, where do you stand in this story? Are you the judge weighing evidence with blindfolded certainty? Are you the lawyer, fighting to pry truth from stone? Are you the bystander in the gallery, shaking your head but saying nothing? Or are you the father, holding your breath as the system decides whether your child's future is worth saving? Because in the end, this isn't just about one boy or one courtroom. It's about all of us. It's about the word life, not as a sentence but as a responsibility. To live with open eyes. To demand fairness even when it's inconvenient. To remember that behind every headline, there's a human being with a story that could have been ours. And maybe the real verdict isn't what the judge said. Maybe the real verdict is the one we deliver every day, by how we choose to see each other, and by whether we dare to fight for something better.